Welcome to Critical History. In this video, everything related to the assassination of Pope John Paul I will be explained. Undoubtedly an infamous act perpetrated by various mafias and sects, which is overlooked in official history. Albino Luciani was ordained pope on August 26, 1978. But contrary to what many expected, his papacy lasted just 33 days. 33 days that were filled with an uncomfortable and cloudy tension inside the Vatican and the Roman Curia. Luciani was a man of very humble origins. He had grown up in a mountainous town of 2,000 people, located 120 kilometers north of Venice. In his home and in his town, people always lived fairly, so Albino learned the values of humility, austerity, and gratitude from a very young age. Once he expressed his desire to be a priest, he received the support of his mother, but more valuable for him was the support of his father, who was a socialist and atheist, and who, despite this, agreed to pay for his admission to the seminary, making a significant economic effort. Luciani did not waste the opportunity and became a priest in 1923. By 1958 he had already been elected bishop of his home region, Vittorio Veneto. During the 11 years that he led this diocese, he was known for making surprise visits to hospitals while cycling through mountain towns, as well as for receiving without an appointment the priests of the area, or anyone who was in trouble. In February 1970, he took office as Patriarch of Venice under the appointment of Pope Paul VI. But back to the topic that concerns us. Luciani's first meeting with his future enemies occurred in 1971, when the Vatican Bank led by Paul Marcinkus agreed to sell the Veneto Catholic Bank, which operated in the Luciani region, and was used as a solidarity bank by priests in the area who took out low-interest loans for social purposes. The problem was that the sale was intended to go unnoticed, notifying anyone other than the Pope, bypassing the authority of the area, Bishop Albino Luciani himself. Everything was uncovered when in 1972 the bank stopped granting low-interest loans to the Catholic clergy of Veneto. Following an investigation by the local church hierarchy, it was revealed that the Institute for Works of Religion, or Vatican Bank, had sold 51% of its shares in Banca Veneto to Roberto Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano. This had been arranged in total secrecy and left a huge profit for the Vatican Bank. The sale, carried out completely without consultation, had Roberto Calvi, a banker closely related to the Italian mafias, as a buyer. This angered Luciani, who complained to Pope Paul VI, but received no response. Then for his part, Luciani decided not to scandalize the matter further, understanding that, if the Pope had approved the sale, there was not much to protest. But yes, he ordered all the priests in his area to withdraw from the bank forever. This gesture of not publicly confronting the Pope so as not to weaken his image would earn him his trust in the future. Although Albino was deeply shocked by what was a case of sale for mere dirty business, it had harmed the priests in his area. This was the first meeting he had with the director of the Vatican Bank, Paul Marcinkus, and the mafia banker Roberto Calvi. The years passed, and in 1978, Paul VI passed away, leaving the door open to a new papal conclave. On August 25, the cardinals entered the chapel, and after 4 rounds of voting, they selected the new pope, Albino Luciani, who chose to be called John Paul I. Luciani came to the papacy largely through the management of Giovanni Bonelli, Patriarch of Florence, who convinced Italian bishops and many Third World bishops. Once his candidacy was imposed, the rest of the voters gave in to this group. John Paul I did not like being selected at all, but once under pressure, he could not say no. His papacy had various things as its agenda: the humanization of the papacy, an encyclical on the Second Vatican Council, and the cleansing of certain elements within the Church. But it was this cleaning that possibly cost him his life. John Paul I sought to make the accounts of the Vatican Bank transparent and cleanse the Church of Freemasonry, an esoteric order that had infiltrated the ranks of the Curia long ago. In 1978, Italy was a hotbed of drug trafficking, violence, and illegal business. All this happened through the mafias, Freemasonry, politics, intelligence services, and of course, the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank had the advantage of being within a separate state, the Holy See. For this reason, the state of Italy did not collect taxes on its shares in the stock market until 1968, and it could not know what was in the hands of the Vatican, since neither external nor internal financial audits were carried out. It was the Vatican, a black box, where illegal businesses were hidden and then passed for clean. Cardinal Vagnozzi, who had to supervise the various economic entities of the Vatican by presenting an annual report, would confess it would take a mixture of the KGB, the CIA, and Interpol to get a glimpse of how much and where the church's money is. This was something that came from the time of Mussolini and Bernardino Nogara, who charted the financial wealth of the modern Vatican between 1929 and 1954. It was under the control of Nogara when shares of the most diverse companies were acquired, and the number of companies multiplied exponentially, coming to accumulate the Holy See countless real estate properties, industrial companies, banks, and other assets. This for 1954 was around the patrimony of $3,000 million. The finances of the Vatican in 1978 passed through Bishop Paul Marcinkus, who had been director of the Vatican Bank since 1971. The gorilla, as he had been nicknamed, used to act as a bodyguard and translator for Pope Paul VI on his trips. He had no formal notion in finance or previous banking experience. However, his good relationship with the Pope would earn him his admission to the Bank of the Holy See as secretary, and from there he would later become director. The client and central partner of the Vatican Bank was the businessman Michele Sindona, who through his banks laundered the money of the Italian mafias. Sindona was a Sicilian based in Milan, who had ventured into the world of finance and who had strengthened ties with the powerful Gambino Mafia of Palermo and New York. After many months of cleaning up the heroin from the Gambinos, he finally bought his first bank, the BPF. It was with this bank that Sindona came to acquire numerous companies and branches, becoming a relevant figure in Milan. Around 1959, he would begin his friendship with the future Pope Paul VI, who was Archbishop of Milan. The future Pope was looking for funds to build a nursing home, and Sindona gave him a donation of $2 million. What the Cardinal did not know is that the origin of those dollars came from the mafia and the sale of heroin. In this way, Sindona had already bought the future Pope, but his contacts with the Vatican did not stop there. He knew how to strengthen strong ties with Massimo Spada, who was administrative secretary of Banco Santo and manager of 24 companies representing the Holy See. It was Spada who would open the doors for Sindona, so that he would become a trustworthy man of the Vatican. This is how, once elected Pope, Paul VI, placed Sindona as an economic advisor to help with tax matters. The Italian government had decided to start taxing the church, and the church responded by hiring an expert in circumventing the law. The Vatican at that time had 20% of Sociedad Generale Immobiliaria, the largest real estate company in all of Italy. These actions are valued at $500 million. This included properties such as the Velasca Tower in Milan, the Hilton Hotel in Rome, the Canadian Stock Exchange Tower, or the Watergate Complex in Washington, among many others. Sindona, at the request of the Pope, bought all of these shares in 1968, associating with the friendly companies Hambros and Gulf Western of the United States. This operation had been set up by the lawyer Umberto Ortolani, who was a member of the P2 Lodge and had deep contacts in the Vatican. This man had been named Pontifical Knight in 1963 by Paul VI himself. He belonged to the Propaganda du Masonic Lodge and was the right hand of its leader, Grand Master Licio Gelli. Licio Gelli, nicknamed the Puppeteer, was the leader of the P2 Lodge, which had influence in all branches of power in Italy, ranging from the judiciary to the armed forces, passing through the Vatican and the mafias. He also had a strong influence in Argentina and Bolivia, but that will be covered in another video. Gelli had transformed P2 into a criminal cell organization, where he was master and lord, and he was the only one who knew all the members. Usually, before initiating a member to the lodge, he had to deliver evidence that compromised him as a guarantee of his loyalty, and if he compromised other relevant people, even better, since everything would be used to force them to collaborate. It was in this way that P2 infiltrated the Vatican through Michele Sindona and Umberto Ortolani, both recognized members. The third is Paul Marcinkus, who was an accomplice and participant in all the financial corruption of the Vatican and a friend of Sindona's since the 1950s. And the fourth is Roberto Calvi, another mafia banker who operated side by side with Sindona on the Milan Stock Exchange, and he was also a member of P2. P2 and the Vatican Bank thus had numerous illegal businesses that gradually came to light. One of them was the famous Finabank di Sindona, which carried out all kinds of fraudulent maneuvers to the detriment of his savers, and of which the Vatican owned 29% of the shares. When, in 1974, the entire Sindona empire went bankrupt, the Finabank would also go bankrupt, leaving a loss of $85 million to the Vatican. The Inspector Secretary of the Holy See, Luigi Manini, would be arrested for his direct connections with Sindona at the Banca Unione. Sindona, after bankrupting the Franklin Bank in New York, the 20th largest bank in the U.S., was rejected by the Vatican and mafia circles. It ended up being Roberto Calvi who took his place. Calvi was president of Banco Ambrosiano, from which he manipulated the stock market, laundered money from the mafia, and evaded taxes. He almost every time with the guarantee of having the Vatican Bank covering his back as the main shareholder. A clear case is that of Superfine. It happens that after the fall of Sindona, Banco Ambrosiano began to lose value on the stock market, but a company called Superfine bought regardless of the context and kept the value afloat. Thus he came to acquire up to 15% of the shares. Then it was learned that Superfine was, on paper, owned by the Vatican Bank and it was acting as a front. He bought Ambrosiano shares from Superfine, so that Calvi would later return the money with interest through other channels. This was the situation when Albino Luciani came to the papacy in August 1978. A church infiltrated by Freemasonry and the Mafia, which had its bishops in Paul Marcinkus, Massimo Spada, Luigi Menini, Sergio Geri, Jean Villot, Paolo Bertoli and Umberto Ortolani, among others. The Order of Malta also served as a link between some of these criminals. Licio Gelli, for example, was knighted in the Order of Malta, on the recommendation of Ortolani, being a declared atheist. Massimo Spada, also a Knight of Malta, was the one who encouraged Sindona to work with the Vatican, being its main promoter. There are even those who affirm that Roberto Calvi and Michele Sindona themselves were Knights of the Order. In this way, both members of the Order of Malta and Freemasonry intertwined and agreed to carry out illegal businesses under the facade of the Church. It didn't take long for John Paul I to realize that something was very wrong within the Holy See. Within days of taking over the Osservatore Politico magazine, run by a P2 member named Mino Pecorelli, he published a list of 121 alleged Freemasons who were part of the Vatican. The Pope, alarmed by this, began to investigate through his means, who of these were actually true Masons and who had been included in the list just to play with public opinion. It was this investigation that would lead him to confess, "There is hardly anyone who explains the situation to me and who presents the problems to me in a clear and detailed way. All I hear are reproaches from all sides." Pecorelli, director of the OP, was a member of P2 and had connections with the intelligence services that provided him with exclusive information for his magazine. It happens that after the leak of the lists of the Freemasons and another leak in relation to the assassination of President Aldo Moro, its leader Licio Gelli lowered his thumb and Pecorelli ended up being killed by 4 bullets in his car in 1979. Meanwhile, Albino Luciani was trying to get to the truth of this whole network, which not only included the Vatican, but all of Italy. With the support of a couple of faithful cardinals like Benelli and Felici, John Paul I came to make up his own list of corrupt and Freemasons to be removed from the Vatican. On the 32nd evening of his papacy, he discussed these changes with his Camerlengo, the Cardinal and Freemason Jean Villot. The characters to be removed included Paul Marcinkus as Luigi Menini, Pellegrino de Strobel and Donato de Bonis, who were all Marcinkus officials and accomplices in his actions. He would also have informed Villot that in the next few days all relations with Banco Ambrosiano would be cut off and that he would be replaced by Cardinal Benelli. With this, Luciani sought to cleanse certain key players from the Vatican Bank, while cutting ties with Banco Ambrosiano. This action put the money laundering system of the mafia as well as the P2 Lodge and the Order of Malta in serious jeopardy. The entire network, the entire dirty money route would be jeopardized if Marcinkus and his accomplices were thrown out of the Vatican. But both the Mafia and the P2 and the Order of Malta had ears in the Holy See. People like Umberto Ortolani and Paul Marcinkus had warned in the early days that this pope was going to be a problem, since he was asking too many questions. Upon receiving this information, Licio Gelli mobilized his contacts to neutralize this serious threat. After telling Villot about the changes that would take place in the church, Luciani shared dinner with Fathers Lorenzi and McGee before having a brief telephone conversation with Cardinal Colombo. At 9:30 p.m. he said goodbye to him and closed the door of his office. The next morning at 4:45, Sister Vicenza, after repeatedly knocking on the door, found him lifeless in her room. Desperate, she woke up Father Lorenzi, who was stunned in front of her body. Minutes later Father McGee arrived, who couldn't believe what he was seeing. Both Lorenzi and McGee had dined with Luciani the night before, and they had seen him perfectly. Father McGee telephoned Cardinal Villot, who arrived and took charge of the situation before anyone else. Villot confiscated the papers and medicines that the Pope had on his bedside table. And then he imposed a vow of silence on those present in the room. No one was to speak until Villot and the Curia decided. Villot's first call was to the embalmers, the Signoraxi brothers, around 5 in the morning. He then contacted cardinals and recently with Dr. Bazzanetti, who came to check the body of the Pope. After a superficial examination of the body, Bazzanetti estimated that he had died of an acute myocardial infarction, that is, a cardiac arrest at 11 p.m. It should be noted that, without an adequate autopsy, it is impossible to know the exact time and reason for death. However, it did not matter. At 7:27 in the morning, the official Vatican bulletin warned that the Pope had died suddenly, probably due to a myocardial infarction, and that he had been discovered by Father McGee at 5:30 p.m. 30 in the morning. This is how the cause and time of death was established without an autopsy and without a death certificate signed by any doctor. As the time of the discovery was also changed from 4:45 to 5:30 in the morning, and Sister Vicenza, who had worked with the Pope since 1959, and who had been the first on the scene, was no longer listed anywhere. But this was only the first hasty lie of Cardinal Villot. In later reports, it was reported that Luciani had been found with the book, The Imitation of Christ, in his hands. The problem was that there was no copy of that book in the pontifical apartments. What's more, Luciani's was still in Venice, and a borrowed copy had already been returned by Father Lorenzi days before his death. After the first hours and still without embalming, the body was put on display in the Clementina room for the general public. On the first day alone, some 250,000 people would come to say goodbye to the deceased. Many and different versions ran through Rome. One of them claimed that the Pope had taken an overdose of his medication for low blood pressure and that it caused his death. But the same Dr. Giovanni Rama, who had prescribed Afordal to Luciani, commented that it was inconceivable to think of an accidental overdose, since the Pope took half a regular dose and they were very prudent with the administration. On the other hand, the version that affirmed that the concerns and the weight of the papacy had caused the cardiac arrest was refuted with the numerous witnesses who affirmed that the Pope was in very good spirits and with strength in his day-to-day. At 4 in the afternoon, the Clementina room closed its doors and the body began to be embalmed. Here a key detail must be reported, and that is that at the express request of the Vatican, not a single drop of blood was extracted from the body. In a regular embalming practice, blood is drawn while chemical solutions are injected. But by this express request, all the blood and organs of the late Pope were preserved within the body. This gives a lot to suspect, since in all cases the blood or part of the body is extracted and disposed of in the sewers. It was clear that there was something to hide. The Signoraxi brothers, in charge of the event, commented that, according to them, the Pope had died between 4 and 5 in the morning due to the absence of rigor mortis. What contrasts with the official version of 11 at night already mentioned. Barely 14 hours had passed and the Pope's body was already embalmed. This is in contrast to the numerous requests from the public and newspapers for an autopsy to be carried out. The Vatican decided to turn a deaf ear to the autopsy request and argued that this practice was prohibited, although in reality this was nothing more than a big lie. Since Pope Paul VI had neither prohibited nor approved autopsy in his Apostolic Constitution of 1975. This constitution is the highest level law in the Church. Therefore, given the murky circumstances, the normal thing would have been to carry it out, more knowing that no apostolic law prohibited it. Preventing the autopsy only added more questions to a death that was already suspicious from the beginning. But another tremendously suspicious episode took place on October 3rd. Luciani's body was being exposed in St. Peter's Cathedral and the entrance to the general public had already been closed. It was 7 p.m. and that time had been reserved for the bishop along with 150 pilgrims from Luciani's hometown to say goodbye to him. The vast majority had met the Pope in person when he cycled through the mountain streets. At least they had gotten a moment of exclusive privacy to send him off in a good way. But around 8 p.m., a group of cardinals and doctors appeared and drove out the pilgrims and the bishop, as well as the Swiss guards. Everyone was outside the room. Large screens were erected behind which a partial autopsy was carried out. At 9:30 p.m., they withdrew and pilgrims waiting to re-enter were denied access. In the following days, this fact became known and the questions multiplied. The Vatican let it be known that there had been a review of the state of the body carried out by the Signoraxi brothers and that it had lasted just 20 minutes. The problem is that, when consulted, the Signoraxi brothers flatly denied having been in such a checkup. Being clear that it was not a routine 20-minute checkup, it is worth asking if it was a partial autopsy. And if it was, why not publish the results to clear up all doubts about the death of the Pope? Another big clue is the absence of a death certificate signed by a licensed doctor. The death of Pope Luciani was not officially corroborated with any death certificate. It is clear that no doctor wanted to risk placing cardiac arrest as the cause without the proper autopsy. Since, without an autopsy, it was impossible to know for sure the cause of death. Around October 5th, a Vatican splinter group leaked to the press that the Pope had not held a book when he died, but rather sheets with appointments for future posts. According to various testimonies, these sheets were the ones that contained the changes that the Pope intended to carry out. The Vatican first said that it was the book, The Imitation of Christ, then when in doubt it said that they were reflections and homilies, to later be sermons and even a magazine. Of course, this did not work, and when the sheets with the changes were leaked, the press director, Father Panzaroli, simply said that they were unfounded. This together with the disappearance of the Pope's testament, which never appeared. Luciani was a methodical and intellectual person, and had spoken to those close to him many times about his will. It is surprising for this, that, after his death, he has not transcended any document of this type. Finally, we must talk about the health of Pope John Paul I. After his death, many false versions were spread about the state of the pontiff. But the reality was very different from the lies that were spread. Luciani's health was monitored by his doctor and friend Giuseppe de Rose. This doctor had been treating him since 1956, and knew all the pathologies he suffered from, the main one being low blood pressure. Dr. de Rose had checked on the Pope on September 23, a week before his death, and had found him in perfect condition. So much so that he had told her that he would return in 3 weeks and not 2 as was normal. John Paul I had the same work rate as 35 years ago. He would wake up at 4:45 a.m., work all day, and then go to bed between 9 and 10 p.m. He had a balanced diet and took daily walks. Father Lorenzi, who accompanied him as secretary for more than 10 years, found him in good spirits and with energy every day. It is really ridiculous to think of a sudden cardiac arrest for a mountain man who ate well and who worked with the same strength and good spirits as always. And that for more historically he suffered from low blood pressure, which is a big factor in avoiding heart attacks. If Luciani had even suffered from any symptoms, both his family doctor and his secretary, both personal friends, would have warned about it and mentioned it to the press. But that didn't happen. Both of them, together with Sister Vicenza, were totally surprised and very affected by the sudden death. Thus we can see how the Pope's closest circle testified to his good mental and physical health. Regarding the manner of death, a low dose of digitalis poison or cyanide placed in his effertil medication would have been enough to kill him. The pontifical apartments did not have great security, contrary to what is thought. By 1978, anyone with any contact inside the Vatican could sneak into the Pope's room if he wanted. Of course, men like Massimo Spada, Paul Marcinkus or Umberto Ortolani could facilitate the entry of whoever they wanted. These men opened the doors of the Vatican, but the orders probably came from outside. It is very possible that Licio Gelli, as a figurehead for the huge mafia that existed in Italy, ordered the assassination to protect his interests and that of all his beneficiaries. Let's not forget that if the Vatican Bank fell, the entire money laundering network collapsed with it. To think that a humble and simple mountain man was going to put an end to all that was something they could not afford. Luciani had to be persuaded or thrown out of the way. After all of the above, and the numerous indications that point to a forced death, other contextual facts must be highlighted, which add more weight to this theory, mainly mentioning the murders that occurred in Italy in those years, and that show a way of operating between the mafias and the P2 Lodge. First, the assassination of Aldo Moro, Prime Minister of Italy, who had sealed a historic pact between the Communist Party and the Christian Democratic Party. The P2 Lodge did not like this pact, so Moro ended up being kidnapped and assassinated by an extremist left-wing group. After the crime, the P2 Lodge was accused of orchestrating everything and covering up its investigations. This occurred in May 1978, months before the death of John Paul I. Second, the murder of Mino Pecorelli, a member of P2 and director of the Osservatore Politico magazine. Pecorelli had published secret information in his magazine about Freemasonry in the Vatican and about the death of Aldo Moro, for which he ended up being shot and killed in March 1979. Third, the murder of Roberto Calvi, banker and director of Banco Ambrosiano. Calvi was being harassed and persecuted by the Italian justice, and by the P2 Lodge at the same time. He eventually ended up being found dead, hanging from the Blackfriars Bridge, with bricks in his pockets. The bricks in the pockets are related to Freemasonry, a symbol that he fell victim to his own associates. And fourth, the murder of Michele Sindona, another banker with strong ties to the Vatican. The Sindona Empire had collapsed long ago, and in fact he was already a prisoner in a maximum security prison. However, in 1986 Sindona was poisoned with cyanide while having a cup of coffee. Apparently his partners no longer trusted his silence. These 4 crimes are linked to the P2 Lodge, 3 of them being relevant members of this lodge. It can be clearly seen that murder was a totally valid solution if required. The sinister puppeteer, Licio Gelli's hand did not tremble when pulling the strings, although of course he was never the one who pulled the trigger. There is a shocking fact about Gelli. According to author David Yallop, Roberto Calvi's wife made a surprising confession to him. The Calvis owned a house of which only 2 people knew the number: Umberto Ortolani and Licio Gelli, leaders of the lodge. Well, when Gelli called Calvi's house, and his daughter or his wife answered, Gelli used a code name to hide his identity. According to this confession, the code name that Gelli used before Calvi's wife or daughter was Luciani. In this way, Gelli used the surname of the late Pope John Paul I as a code name to communicate with Calvi. Another interesting fact weighs on the movie Godfather III. This is nothing more than a mirror of Michele Sindona and his ties to the Vatican in the 1960s and 1970s. Sindona was a good friend of the owner of the production company that made the film, Mr. Bluedorn. Charlie Bluedorn owned Paramount Pictures and the entire Gulf Western conglomerate. He had met Sindona thanks to David Kennedy, and between the 3 of them they had bought part of the Sociedad General Inmobiliaria from the Vatican. Just like the movie shows. The Godfather III was made at the express request of Charlie Bluedorn, and is dedicated to him in the credits. Bluedorn in this installment, the only thing he wanted was to reveal in the cinema the stories that his good friend Michele Sindona had told him. It is worth saying that in this film, John Paul I dies of poisoning. Also, another relevant fact is that the pontiff died on the 33rd day of his papacy. The number 33 is a very important number in Freemasonry as well as in esotericism. The 33rd degree is the maximum that can be reached in the Scottish Rite, and is essential to become a Grand Master. It is likely that Freemasonry, represented by the P2 Lodge, chose the 33rd day to carry out the crime. Finally, we must mention two statements, made years after the fact. The first, that of mobster Anthony Raimondi, Lucky Luciano's nephew, who in 2019, confessed in his memories that at the request of his alleged cousin Paul Marcinkus, he had participated in the murder of Pope Luciani. According to him, Juan Pablo I would have died poisoned with cyanide to prevent him from uncovering a fraud of $1,000 million. The other statement comes from the Pope's niece and brother. Both maintain that there was a will and that the Church hid it forever. They say that Luciani had already written wills and that he had mentioned them several times while he was with them. They also deny the version of a pope stressed or lacking in strength in his day-to-day, having visited him in person days before his death. It is in this way that the death of Pope Luciani was configured within an Italy submerged under the mafias and secret sects, which hid behind the supposed Republic and the Vatican. Luciani's will to at least clean up part of this framework ended up costing him his life. Issues such as the lack of an official death certificate signed by a doctor, the body embalmed in 14 hours and without taking blood, the lack of an official autopsy as well as a secret and partial autopsy but not published, the lies regarding the papers that the Pope maintained when he died and the lies also about his health during the papacy, are strong indicators that there was something more than a simple cardiac arrest. If you liked the video, share it with your acquaintances. If you want to support the channel, you can support us from Patreon. We are already very grateful. A good greeting and see you in the next video.